George versus George, the American Revolution as seen from both sides, by Rosalyn Schanzer. This is a pretty long story, a lot going on, and so I'm just going to read a few parts of it. You can buy the book and read the rest on your own, or read other books about this topic. But this is my July 4th video reading on the American Revolution. For Nancy, Jane E., and Steve. Introduction. There once were two enemies who were both named George. George Washington was the man who freed the American colonies from the British, and George III was the British king who lost them. Was King George a royal brute? American patriots said so, but others hailed him as the father of the people. Was George Washington a traitor? The king's supporters thought so, but many celebrated Washington as the father of his country. Who was right? There are two sides to every story. At first glance, the year was 1763, and in many ways, George Washington of America and King George III of Great Britain were very much alike. Both men had light blue eyes and reddish-brown hair, athletic and dignified in appearance. Each stood well over 6 feet tall, towering above most other men during a time when the average height was 5'7". Both were honest and popular with the public. They liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to the high-fashion outfits of the period, decorated with lace, ruffles, and embroidery. George III was sometimes called Farmer George because of his lifelong interest in agriculture. George Washington was a farmer who was happiest when working on his land. Both were excellent horsemen and loved hunting. George III believed that a king should rule America. For a long time, George Washington thought so too. He had even fought bravely alongside the British Army. Here's George Washington and King George III. The people of Great Britain and the people from Britain's American colonies had a lot in common too. Most people on both sides of the ocean liked their good-natured young patriot king. English was their main language, after all. 60% of the colonists had British ancestors. London was everybody's capital city, and many Americans proudly thought of England as home. Great Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, which involved almost every country in Europe and extended all the way to India and Australia. King George was now the ruler of the world's greatest empire. I would say largest empire, not necessarily great. As loyal citizens of Great Britain, colonial soldiers had joined forces with soldiers from England to fight against France for control of North America. When France gave up its territories, jubilant celebrations were held throughout both England and America. Who could imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, or that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies? Who could guess that George III would be the last king of America, and that George Washington would one day become its first president? Neither George Washington nor King George III was fully responsible for everything that happened next. Many other thinkers, soldiers, and politicians helped shape the future. Even so, as the leaders of the two sides, these two Georges were to become the strongest symbols of their countries during the next 20 years. The different ideas they stood for would soon turn the whole world upside down. Skipping some pages here. The trouble with taxes. So what stirred up the hornet's nest in the first place? It all began over money, and over the rights of citizens too. Great Britain had been in one war or another for 50 years and was drowning in debt. Over in London, Parliament decided that Americans should help by paying their fair share, and King George agreed. After all, Great Britain had spent plenty of money fighting in America for the good of the colonies. The Crown was still supporting a British army to help stop Indian attacks on the American frontier. It was Great Britain's right to collect payment. To raise the money, Parliament raised a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act passed a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act saying that colonists had to pay taxes to Great Britain for all sorts of imported goods, from molasses, blue indigo, dye, pimentos, to printed items such as marriage licenses, playing cards, and newspapers. Similar taxes were often collected in England, but the colonies were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts and to run the colonies. A lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. Besides, they believed it was against the British Constitution. Ever since the Middle Ages, English law had said that there should be no taxation without representation. This meant that citizens could never be taxed unless their elected representatives voted to pay. Many colonial merchants refused to buy British goods. Pamphlet writers soared. Preachers thundered from their pulpits. Angry members of an organization called the Sons of Liberty stripped royal office holders naked and covered them with hot tar and goose feathers. They used to tar and feather folks in Great Britain, too, in those days. King George was sure that certain gentlemen who pretend to be patriots in Massachusetts were no more than criminals. So he sent a fleet of warships to Boston to make them behave. 700 soldiers wearing fancy uniforms soon paraded out Boston streets with muskets on their shoulders. Whenever they went off duty, many stole, got drunk, and chased women. Some also infuriated worshippers by purposely racing horses, beating drums, and gambling under church windows on Sundays. On March 1770, an angry mob of American rowdies started taunting 8 of King George's soldiers and pelting them with icy snowballs. Then someone threw a lump of wood at a redcoat and knocked him flat. The enraged troops began firing into the crowd, and 5 colonists were killed. Furious Sons of Liberty were quick to label this disaster the Boston Massacre, and it stirred up plenty of anger on both sides. A Tempest Over Tea, 1770 to 1774. It just so happened that on the very same day as the violence in Boston, Parliament and King George over in London were trying to keep the peace. They got rid of all import taxes except for one tiny tax on British tea. They thought that would solve the problem, but it didn't. Lots of colonists resented paying any British taxes, no matter how tiny. It was a matter of principle. Some refused to drink British tea and drank tea smuggled from Holland instead. Others, including George Washington, stopped drinking tea altogether. On the night of December 16, 1773, some Sons of Liberty covered their faces and hands with coal dust, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and very calmly filed on board 3 ships filled with tea. Hundreds gathered to watch as the men split open 342 chests of British Darjeeling tea with tomahawks and fed all 45 tons of it to the fish. Most Britons were outraged when they heard news of the wanton destruction. Americans were clearly a race of convicts. They had gone too far and must be punished. 6 months later, the king and an angry parliament closed Boston Harbor. Nothing could come in and nothing could go out. George versus George, 1774 to 1775. The port closure quickly put huge numbers of Bostonians out of work. People were afraid they would starve. Other colonies scrambled to help by sending food, clothing, and flocks of sheep. Americans smuggled in at least 5,000 chests of tea from Holland alone. They also smuggled in gunpowder. Bostonians began to think of war. As the siege continued, people from all over the colonies became more and more alarmed. If Boston was in such a sea of trouble, who was to say that worse things couldn't happen in Philadelphia or Williamsburg or Charleston? George Washington didn't approve of the Tea Party one bit, but he approved of the punishment even less. During September and October of 1774, delegates from all 13 colonies met together in one place for the first time ever at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. George Washington was one of the delegates. The Congress sent an appeal for peace and harmony to King George and suggested that Parliament get rid of all of the unconstitutional laws controlling America. Until then, the colonies would not import or buy any British goods and would not export any of their own goods to the mother country. The shot heard round the world. Everybody's nerves were on edge. Still holding their weapons, the Patriots began to back away and look for cover. I've skipped a little bit, but they've gathered in Lexington. Then someone fired a shot. Nobody knows who. But as soon as they heard it, the British soldiers started shooting. 8 Americans were killed and 10 more were wounded. Not everyone realized it at the time, but the Revolutionary War had just begun. John Hancock and Sam Adams had disappeared. The war had just begun. The Redcoats marched on to Concord to destroy the ammunition, but most of the ammunition had vanished too. Meanwhile, great multitudes of men from farms and villages all over the country gathered to fight back. Each side told a different tale about Lexington and Concord. Rebel newspapers reported that bloodthirsty redcoats burned houses, drove naked women into the streets, and butchered old men and infants. The king was told that rebel savages broke the rules of war by ambushing his army. Then they scalped fallen British infantry and cut off their ears. George Washington was already famous for his fearless leadership when he had fought alongside the British 20 years earlier. On June 15, 1775, the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia and unanimously elected the 43-year-old Virginian to become commander-in-chief of their newly formed Continental Army. But how could a small, poorly trained army with almost no money defeat one of the world's most awesome military powers? Washington refused to accept any salary, asking only that Congress pay his expenses. You can read about the Battle of Bunker Hill on your own. British forces. King George made it official. The colonists were rebel outlaws, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, traitorously preparing for war. Enough was enough. He had to show them who was boss. The king enlisted more troops in Britain and hired German troops too. He sent ships to blockade the American coast so that the colonists couldn't get any outside supplies. Then his soldiers sat back to wait for the colonial army to fall to pieces. The king's war-hardened, brutally disciplined, and well-trained fighting force included 5 kinds of fighters. British regulars, Hessians, these are the German soldiers for hire, Loyalists, which were Americans who were still fighting for the British, and Indians, or Native Americans, and the British Navy. In Europe, soldiers were taught that the fair and honorable way to fight was to march openly into battle in columns, lining up in rows shoulder to shoulder, and advance toward the enemy without firing a shot until they were close enough to be sure of hitting their targets. Since their muskets were not very accurate, they fired together all at once. Troops were traditionally trained to fight on flat land during the daytime in good weather. Nothing had prepared them to fight their way through thick forests, raging rivers, mosquito-infested swamps, and long mountain ranges. Rebel forces. George Washington took command of the Continental Army, the colony's main fighting force, on July 3, 1775, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He immediately took steps to build a professional army. It wouldn't be easy. Washington despaired over the inexperience of his volunteers, the constant desertions, and a paralyzing lack of food and military supplies. Sometimes redcoats could shoot rebel soldiers at will because the rebels didn't have enough gunpowder to shoot back. There were three types of forces fighting against the British. George Washington's Continental Army, the Continental Navy, and militias, people hired to fight. As difficult as things were for the rebel forces, they did have some strong advantages. Though George Washington drilled his army in British-style warfare, rebel soldiers had learned from fighting the Indians to travel light, hide in the woods and mountains, and use ambushes and lightning raids against an unsuspecting enemy. They could move quickly, and their earth-toned homespun and buckskin clothes let them melt into the countryside unseen. The British considered these tactics not to be honorable. These tactics to be dishonorable. A new nation. While Washington's soldiers and King George's soldiers were fighting one another, the Continental Congress made a crucial decision. Instead of just battling for their rights as citizens of Great Britain, they decided to aim for total American independence. To rally Americans to their cause and get support from Europe, they set to work writing a document that claimed the right of all people to choose their own government. It placed the blame for every single one of their grievances squarely on the shoulders of King George himself. This document was the Declaration of Independence, and its signers had just given birth to the United States of America. Supporters of Great Britain thought the signers were traitors who used the Declaration of Independence to attack their own king and promote war against him. To American rebels, though, King George was a traitor to his own British citizens in America because he refused to uphold their British constitutional rights. The rebels gathered to celebrate their independence. Tremendous crowd of merrymakers beat drums, burned bonfires, held a mock burial of King George, and pulled a gilded statue of the king on horseback off its pedestal and melted it down to make bullets for army muskets. The king was thoroughly dismayed. "I wish nothing but good. Everyone who does not agree is a traitor or a scoundrel." King George. These speech bubbles are all real historical things that people said that we have in written documents. The king's critics in England still howled that the war wasn't worth the cost. People were losing their jobs because Great Britain no longer sold goods to Americans. In London, redcoats killed 500 unemployed workers who were rioting in the streets. The French greatly admired the American cause. On February 6, 1778, King Louis XVI of France signed a treaty that recognized the United States as a new nation. He promised to send ships, soldiers, and money to help the rebel army fight his old enemy, the British. More and more black soldiers were fighting for both sides. In the southern states, some slave owners, too lazy or afraid to fight, sent their slaves to fight instead. A visitor to the mostly black Rhode Island regiment said it was the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, and the most precise in movements. So what was happening to American civilians all this time? For one thing, a vicious civil war was being fought between Americans in favor of independence and Americans who were against it. In the North, rebels broke into homes of Americans loyal to King George and hauled them off to prison. Quakers couldn't fight for religious reasons. The Patriots tarred and feathered them anyway, even when they hired substitutes. When times got too tough, Loyalists fled to the British colonies of Canada and Nova Scotia. Plenty of women were involved in the war too. Some of them served as spies or guides. A Quaker housewife living across from the British headquarters in Philadelphia often overheard information about Redcoats' war plans. She sewed the news inside cloth-covered buttons and sent her young son to deliver them to George Washington. A black woman named Camino Dolly guided British soldiers through a swamp so that they could sneak up behind rebel troops and capture Savannah, Georgia. The final battle. Leaders on both sides began to think the war could finally be won with a major victory in the South. Up north in New York, George Washington got wind that British General Charles Lord Cornwallis and his men were marching toward the Virginia tobacco port city of Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay, brutally terrorizing area residents as they went. In August 1781, Cornwallis finished setting up his base of operations. Washington had just learned that the French were sending 28 ships to help the American forces. Would it be possible to set a trap for Cornwallis? The timing would have to be absolutely perfect. First, Washington's men joined forces with an army of French ground troops in New York. Then, both armies sneaked past the northern redcoats and raced night and day for 500 miles all the way south toward Yorktown. By October 1771, 3 weeks after Washington set the trap, Cornwallis's forces were starving. Unburied bodies lay everywhere. The ground was shaking violently from the thunder of 100 cannons, and the sky was streaked with red from shots flying across enemy lines. All of a sudden, a British officer appeared through the smoke, waving a white handkerchief to signal defeat. Joyous Americans started to let out a tremendous cheer, but George Washington silenced his men, shouting, "Let history huzzah for you." No kings for America. King George tried hard to continue the struggle, but British support faded fast. The king was so humiliated that he almost gave up his crown. It took several years for his attitude to change. Here's King George III saying, "Till driven to the wall, I certainly will do what I can to save the empire. And if I do not succeed, I will not be a tool in the destruction of the honor of the country." George Washington was encouraged by an officer in his army to become the King of America. He was horrified. "If you have any regard for your country, concern yourself or posterity, or respect for me, banish these thoughts from your mind." George Washington did not want to be king. It took 2 years of meetings to plan for peace. In Paris, France, on September 3rd, 1783, England finally signed a peace treaty with France and Spain that also included total independence and a vast amount of land for America. At long last, it was official. King George and Great Britain had lost the 13 colonies forever, and the United States of America had been born. And that is why fireworks are going off and other celebrations are happening for the 4th of July. Because that is seen as the start of America, when the Declaration of Independence was delivered. But that was George versus George, the American Revolution as seen from both sides, by Rosalyn Schanzer. King George III versus George Washington of America. And this is EDU Kids Space. Subscribe for more stories, books, and lessons. Hit the bell button so you're notified when I put out new videos. And if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon page in the video comments. Thank you.